Hi everyone, this is William Lee, and I am going to try something new today. You know me from the 1906 diary entries when Dmitri was 14 years old, but I mentioned recently that I may, as an experiment, try one of the adult diary entries. And since I'm currently translating the diary entries for December 1920, the end of December 1920, I am going to start there, even though it's fairly random, because I'm thinking a lot about these particular diary entries and what was going on in Dmitri's life at that time. But when I looked at the most recent translation from the 29th of December, I realized that there was too much interesting stuff going on before and setting the scene for what Dmitri was writing about on the 28th and 29th. So I am going back to the 24th. So Dmitri puts it in his diary 24th/11th. So the 11th would it have been January? Let's see. The Julian calendar was behind the Gregorian calendar, so it would have been the 11th of December on the Julian calendar and the 24th December on the Gregorian calendar. So I'm not sure if Russia had made the switch yet, if Bolshevik Russia had made the switch yet to the Gregorian calendar, but the 24th would have been the date in the West where Dmitri was. So this diary entry was written en route from Paris, where Dmitri was living, to Monte Carlo, where he was going for a holiday, but a working holiday. He had some important things to talk to people about there. It's not a particularly long diary entry, but it is one that requires a lot of annotation. When the diary entry itself is published, when the diaries are published, one of the big obstacles to accomplishing that task, which I've been working on for years just on the translation, is or will be doing the annotations. So even to do this as a video, it's going to be long, and it's going to require a lot of explanation and a lot of introductions. So if you can picture what you would have written in your diary entry when you were 14 years old versus what you would have written if your country had recently experienced a revolution and you were now living in exile and with really no ground beneath your feet and needing to establish your own life and being part of a community that was trying to reinvent itself and establish some kind of stability and identity for itself. So this is extremely complex material, which is one of the reasons why this is an experiment. And you may think you'll be more interested in Dmitri's adult diary, but at least this section of his adult diary, is mainly going to appeal to you if you are very much interested in the history of the emigre Russia right after the revolution. And so we'll get into more social things in the diary entries to come very, very closely very soon after this diary entry, but this diary entry on Dmitri's last day in Paris before he went off to Monte Carlo deals with really important things. And at the end of one of my videos on a 1906 diary entry, I talked about, if you're interested in Dmitri, if you're writing anything about Dmitri, two things that you really need to know. One is that he was always looking for a family. He wanted to be part of a real family. And the other was that he was always hoping to play a public role and a political role, and to be a man of consequence with respect to Russia's future. And at this point, in December 1920, he was still thinking that he could end up as the Emperor of Russia. Nobody knew if the Bolshevik movement was going to last. The Civil War was basically over, and the Bolsheviks had won. So it wasn't going to be quite as simple as they thought it would be to reestablish a monarchy in Russia, but they were still hopeful about that, and Dmitri was one of the leading contenders for various reasons. I mean, I could talk about this for an hour, so I'm not going to go deeply into that, but he was still considered a possibility. In fact, so much so that in 1918, Britain, the Foreign Office in Great Britain, had agreed to arrange for him to get a commission in the British Army solely on the basis that they were persuaded that he could well be the next Russian emperor, or Tsar, if not emperor, and that it could pay off then for them to establish a strong relationship with him. So he himself had taken some steps to prepare himself for the possibility of that role. He went to various scholars, both Russian and English, when he was in London, to learn about law and the history of socialism and economics. But he, of course, said that he was not interested in being emperor, and whether that was true or not, it's hard to say. I mean, he was writing in his diaries. He wasn't making it as a public statement, though he may have said that as well. I can't recall if he told that to anyone. But, you know, they always say that that was the formula in Imperial Rome, that if you were offered the role of Emperor of Rome, that the first thing you were expected to do was decline it. So I suspect that, yeah, he probably had mixed feelings about it, but I suspect that he was quite interested in taking on such a role if it was offered to him. So one of the things that was going on at this period of time, immediately before this diary entry, and it was ongoing, was that Kirill Vladimirovich had turned up in Western Europe. He'd gotten out of Russia through Finland, and he'd turned up in France, and he was putting out feelers himself about being, he was making the claim that he was the legitimate heir to Nicholas II, that he should be the Emperor of Russia, and a lot of people, including Dmitri, opposed that vehemently for various reasons, both because they questioned his legitimacy as the heir and because of his behavior in favor of the provisional government when the revolution first occurred. And in fact, Dmitri had responded favorably to the provisional government as well, but he was off in Persia at that time, and he was simply in contact with Kerensky, who became the head of the provisional government. and had said that he was willing to swear his allegiance to the provisional government. But he seemed, and other people seem to have considered that, if they knew about it, acceptable by comparison to what Kirill had done. He had famously put on a red ribbon and marched to the Duma at the head of a contingent of, he was a Navy man, of the Naval Guard's equipage, I think, who were also wearing red ribbons. And so that was considered by many people, and including Dmitri, to be something that had absolutely disqualified him to be the emperor in exile. And if you know this whole story from beginning to end, then you know how ironic that was, because Dmitri would, by 1923, after crashing and burning in his attempt to develop a political role for himself on his own, would go then and ally himself with Kirill. And in fact, his son confided to me that Dmitri absolutely loathed Kirill, which makes it all the worse, I suppose, that he was willing to back Kirill up. But that's neither here nor there for the moment. So let's get started with this, and then we'll go to the introductions of the people who are mentioned in the diary entry and some analysis of it. Okay. 24th, 11th December 1920, Friday, in transit between Paris and Monte Carlo. Tolstoy Miloslavsky came to see me in the morning, but he didn't have anything interesting to say. Then Loris Melikov came, the former ambassador to Siam, and brought General Schwartz to see me. The latter was very interesting because he served on the Red Staff in Petrograd. The main reason he came was to tell me all about his plan for seizing Petrograd. It was, of course, interesting, but extremely naive and childishly ill-considered. It's surprising that such a serious person could occupy himself with such nonsense. Then Mika Gorchakov turned up. He wants to send documents of some kind to the King of Spain. He was, of course, terribly worked up and talked a great deal. I went to Maria's for lunch. Sandro Leuchtenberg was there with his wife. Afterwards, I went home and wrote, then changed my clothes and went back to Maria's. Shagubatov very, very kindly brought my things to the station because Sivonya had left earlier on another train. We somehow got sidetracked at Maria's, and then there wasn't a car, as a result of which we almost missed the train. We made it, thanks to Jean Crisovilloni, who put all of us in, and then there's an illegible word, all the way to the station. The group was made up of Maria, Gulia, both Polovtsovs, Mimi and Pete, and myself. So that's something, that's another reason that makes this somewhat experimental for me, and another barrier to having published my translation of the diaries so far, is that there are many illegible words, and I don't have that problem with the 1906, 1907 diaries, because the Russian woman who so kindly sent them to me, she had gotten copies from the Central State Archive in Moscow, and she had typed them out, and so I have typewritten copies of those, which makes it so much easier. Even though I'm fairly good with Dmitri's handwriting, I would say quite good, but the quality is not, it varies quite a bit, depending on what he's writing with, where he's writing, in bed, on a train, or sitting at his desk, and what kind of mood he's in, if he's in a hurry, so on and so forth. It makes a big difference as to whether his handwriting is legible or not. So that's another obstacle to overcome as far as the publishing the translation is concerned, or doing the translation. So Maria, of course, is his sister. And I should mention another thing that was going on at this time, because you'll find references to it in future diary entries, which is that the Sokolov investigation had concluded, the investigation into the murder of Nicholas II and his family, and that was a very contentious issue, and he had all these documents, including reputedly human remains, a finger from the Empress and some bones, and there was a real fight within the emigre community for possession of those, and Dmitri was at the forefront of that fight. And so you'll see reference to that in future diary entries. And now, before I start on the introductions, I would like to show you this book. Any of you that read French and are interested in getting more background information on these diary entries, Les Russes Blancs, so the White Russians. And this is specifically about the White Russian emigre community and its activities in France. And I think this is the author's father or grandfather. The author was himself a White Russian, Alexander Zhivakov. And if you're not familiar with the term White Russian, it is not a racial term. It means a Russian who was anti-red. Many of them were Tsarist, not all of them, but they were all anti-Bolshevik. And so this book is helping me put things in perspective about what was going on in the broader emigre community during this period in Dmitri's diaries. And several of the people who are mentioned in this diary entry that I just read are also mentioned in this book, so I was able to get a little more information about them, apart from my initial notes that I did years and years ago. So the first thing that I would like to say about this before diving into the introductions is that the people who were meeting Dmitri that morning were not lightweights. These were, for the most part, serious people, and the fact that they were going to see him meant that to a certain extent he had succeeded at this point in being the central figure in the imperial family that people were going to consult with. Important people and people of consequence. And Kirill was already in France at that time. He was already in Paris, either Paris or he may have moved on to Cannes. And in fact, when he'd first arrived in Paris, Dmitri had actually left Paris and gone to London for a while, because he didn't want to meet Kirill on the street or at any emigre events, because, according to him, he was afraid of losing his temper with Kirill and saying things to Kirill that he didn't want to say, that it would create a scandal to say it so directly. But anyway, he had gathered this little group of Russian monarchists of some note around him, and he'd had meetings with them and so on and so forth, and he was sort of making himself available at that time, and so various people would come to see him. So let's get down to the introductions. So the first paragraph, he's visited by Tolstoy Miloslavsky, Loris Melikov, and General Schwartz. So Tolstoy Miloslavsky I'm less sure about, because there were two men by that name who turned up in the diaries. They were cousins. One was Sergei and one was Pavel. And they were cousins specifically. Were they cousins? Or were they brothers? I have cousins in my notes because they were cousins of Kazimbiek, of Alexander Kazimbiek, who would soon be starting what was called the Young Russia, Well, first it was just called Young Russia, and then it would become a political party called the Young Russia Party, and Dmitri would end up very actively involved in that. What I can say about the Tolstoy-Miloslavskis now is that both of them would turn up at the Reichenhall, Russian monarchist conference in Germany. So there were two such conferences. One was the Reichenhall conference, which Dmitri did not attend, and the other was a conference in Berlin that he did go to, and both were pretty much right-wing affairs. Dmitri had sort of a foot in both camps, with the right wing and with the left wing, and he would one of the roles he would try to develop for himself would be as a liaison and someone trying to unite those two camps for the common cause of liberating Russia from the Bolsheviks. But we will talk about that later. So it was either Sergei or Pavel Tolstoy-Miloslavsky who turned up, but didn't, as it turned out, have anything interesting to say, as Dmitri puts it. Then Loris Melikov came. So this was Count Yosef Grigorievich Loris Melikov, and he was a diplomat by profession. And so, again, not a lightweight, someone who'd been very important, had an important role in foreign policy in Imperial Russia. Well, not so much foreign policy in the sense of making it, but in the sense of advising and implementing it. So he had diplomatic posts in Siam, in Sweden, and in Norway. And when the revolution had happened, he'd gone back to Russia and he'd fought in Siberia under Kolchak, who was one of the main white Russian military leaders, and trying to set up his own government in Siberia, his own anti-Bolshevik government in Siberia. And Count Loris Melikov, unlike Dmitri himself, we can criticize him for that, or we can say that he did the right thing, but either way, he didn't participate. He didn't go back to Russia and participate in the Civil War. But a lot of these people who are now coming to meet with him had done that, and it didn't seem to bother them that he hadn't done that. All right, so Loris Melikov and Tolstoy-Miloslavsky, neither of them were important enough in the Russian in a general sense, in the Russian immigrant community in France to have made it into this book. But Loris Melikov comes for the purpose of bringing someone to see Dmitri who was very consequential in the emigration. And this was General Schwartz, who was Alexei Vladimirovich, and there were several General Schwartzes in Imperial Russia, and after the revolution in Russia itself, there was one, I think, Nikolai Nikolaevich, who stayed, and they were all, obviously had German surnames, but that was not at all uncommon in the Russian military and in the Russian civil service. So people didn't think twice about that. And General Schwartz was, again, not at all a lightweight. Dmitri says that he was interesting because he had served on the Red Staff in Petrograd. And in English, General Schwartz has a very short Wikipedia entry. In Russian, there's a lot more material on him. And he, again, was a man of consequence, both in pre-revolutionary Russia and in post-revolutionary Russia. But unfortunately, so actually before the war, during the war and shortly after the revolution, this may be what Dmitri was referring to, because he had been there for a couple years apparently after the revolution, and he'd kept his post as a professor of military engineering, and he was really regarded as the foremost expert in the Russian military on fortifications. So not a stupid person at all. And he had this very sinister side to him, because he was an extreme right-winger and he was an extreme anti-Semite. And he wouldn't be a person whom Dmitri would be having much to do with in the future, because Dmitri was not an extremist at all. And General Schwartz, in fact, would start a publishing company and would be maybe the first Russian publisher outside of Russia to publish the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion that are still causing trouble to this day. So, in this instance, Dmitri clearly hadn't met him before, and the reason Loris Melikov has brought him is so that he can tell Dmitri about this plan he has for seizing Petrograd. Even though the Civil War is basically over and the whites have lost, he has this plan now of seizing Petrograd. And maybe he was becoming something of a crackpot, because Dmitri didn't find it at all convincing. In fact, he even calls it extremely naive and childishly ill-considered. And the revolution did bring out this side of people. You know, it snapped something a little bit. And the Young Russia Party, too, in later years would come up with some kind of naive and childish plans for a regime change in Russia. But anyway, at this first meeting, Dmitri isn't particularly impressed by Schwartz, and I think that's a good thing. So then the next person who's mentioned, who turns up, as it says in the diary, is Mikha Gorchakov. Every time I see that name, I want to say Mikha Gorbachev. But it was Gorchakov. He was a prince, and I don't know much about him. I believe, unfortunately, that he would later also be involved in some aspect of getting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion out there for the public. And he was also behaving like a kind of crackpot, apparently. So he knew that Dmitri was close and a good friend of the King of Spain, who at that time was Alfonso XIII. He was close to Alfonso. He was close to Alfonso's wife, Ina, who was born a British princess. And so he certainly could have sent documents on to Alfonso, but it doesn't sound like he's too interested in that. And he just mentions how Gorchakov is so terribly worked up and talking on and on. Okay, and I guess whatever documents Gorchakov wants to send to Alfonso, he either doesn't tell Dmitri what they are, or Dmitri doesn't find them to be anything that he's interested in mentioning. Okay, so then he goes to Maria's for lunch, and there he finds another member of the family, Sandro Leuchtenberg. I should say. So this is the Duke of Leuchtenberg, and his wife, who was named Nadezhda Nikolaevna, a Russian woman. And they'd gotten married in 1917, and I believe that Sandro Leuchtenbergsky, as he was called in Russian, he was a great-grandson of Nicholas I, and I believed he'd basically spent his entire life in Russia. So despite being a German duke, he was very, very Russian. And one interesting note I have about him is that in February 1917, he had urged Nicholas to demand a second oath of allegiance from the members of the imperial family, and that presumably would have included Dmitri, who had already been sent into exile. And apparently Nicholas did not do that, And it must have been right before Nicholas's abdication. Obviously, it wouldn't have taken place after the abdication. And Sandro Leuchtenberg is a person who will turn up throughout the diaries and will continue to turn up and will visit Dmitri when Dmitri is at Schatzalp and in Davos at the end of his life. And Sandro Leuchtenberg, if I remember correctly, also spent some time in a sanatorium in Davos, Guardaval, which was a sanatorium for tuberculosis of the eyes. But I better not linger on that. So Sandro is there and his wife are there having lunch at Maria's place. Quite natural. Dmitri says afterwards he went home and wrote. So in his 1906 diaries, when he's 14, he's writing at the end of the day. He's writing before he goes to bed. But his habit in exile was to write in the morning, to get up and spend the morning writing. But obviously his morning had been too busy in this instance. So he had to go home after lunch and do his writing of his diary entries that he was extremely devoted to. Okay, and he was committed to writing his diaries, and he did it consistently during this period of time, no matter what was going on in his life. So then he got changed and went back to Maria's. He was putting on his traveling clothes because they were about to leave for Monte Carlo, and he mentions that Shagubatov had, as he puts it, very, very kindly brought his things to the station. So Shagubatov had been his adjutant in before he'd been kicked out of Russia, and Shagubatov did not go with him into his Persian exile. But he turned up in Paris and resumed that role. And my impression is that Dmitri was not paying him. Dmitri couldn't really afford to pay him at that time. But he was, he was dedicated, and he did it voluntarily. I think. I'm not 100% sure about that. He doesn't seem to have been an employee, and he does seem to have genuinely been a friend. Although eventually he disappears. He disappears when Dmitri stops writing his diaries for a while after 1921, and then he doesn't reappear later when the diary is resumed. But anyway, he's done this. He's taken the luggage to the train station. Dmitri is clearly grateful. And the reason that Shagubatov has done this is because Savodnya has already gone on to Monte Carlo on an earlier train to get things prepared for his employer. Because when it comes to Savodnya, he was indeed an employee. He was Dmitri's valet, I guess you would say, sort of his man. He wasn't a gentleman. He was just a servant. But he, unlike Shagubatov, had gone with Dmitri to Persia. Dmitri had been allowed to take Savodnya with him. And the interesting thing about Savodnya, his Christian name was Pyotr. I don't know his patronymic because Dmitri never says it. But Savodnya is a very unusual surname because it means today. It's the Russian word for today. So if you ever meet a person named Mr. Today or Mrs. Today, I think you'll probably ask them how they got that surname. In Savodnya's case, my guess would be that he came from the peasantry and that it was probably an old serf name. It was probably a serf who'd been called Today for whatever reason, because he used the word, or who knows. That's just a guess on my part. So whatever they're doing at Maria's house, they get sidetracked, probably because the Leuchtenbergs are there, and they almost end up missing their train, but somebody comes to the rescue, and the person who comes to the rescue is Jean Crisivelloni, very important person in the 1920s diaries. So he was an extremely wealthy banker from Romania, And he was a close connection of Missy, of Queen Maria of Romania, and Maria, Dmitri's sister, and her husband Gulia had spent time in Romania. They'd gone to Romania after they'd gotten out of Russia, and so it makes perfect sense that they had this connection with the Chrysovalonis. Jean Chrysovaloni, his wife was named Sybil, and she and Dmitri were never an item. Dmitri didn't have any scruples when it came to going after married women, but they don't seem to have been an item, although she does seem to have been a bit smitten with Dmitri because she got him an apartment, rented an apartment for him in Paris, and furnished it at a time when he absolutely didn't have the resources to do that, when he was having trouble paying his bills in general. So she did that for him, and the Chrysovalonis and Jean would give Dmitri a loan of 45,000 francs. I don't know how much that would have been at that time. And he and Sybil would allow Maria and Gulia to live at their home, and Jean would also give Gulia a job in a bank in Paris. So they, everything I see about them in the diaries leads me to believe that they were kind, good-hearted people, and there were other immensely wealthy people that Dmitri and Maria knew who were not willing to come to their aid at all. All right, so Gulia, of course, was a Prince Sergei Mikhailovich Putyatyn, whom Maria had married in Russia after the revolution, when she no longer had to worry about marrying someone royal. And in fact, she was a divorcee at any rate. And then Mimi and Pete Alexandrovich, in addition to Sandro Leuchtenberg, will never disappear from the diaries and will continue to be mentioned in the Schatzalp diaries. So once again, we're not talking, when we talk about Pete Alexandrovich Polovtsov, so Pyotr, he was called Pete, we're not talking about someone who was in any way a lightweight. Very, very intelligent man, educated, given a good, solid academic education in Russia, as was his brother Alexander Alexandrovich, whom Dmitri also knew but wasn't close to, like he was to Pete. They both were very well educated, very highly respected, and very successful. Alexander was a diplomat. Pete went into the military. He was a general, but he also had traveled the world as a military, I don't know if he was an attaché or what. He has a long Wikipedia entry in Russian that I should have read instead of just skimming, but he was one of the military staff at various Russian legations and embassies. And he was in his 40s, so he was not quite 20 years older than Dmitri. I think he'd been born in 1875, and Dmitri was born in 1891. And so he could also be a little bit of a mentor, and he seems to have played that role. And Mimi, oddly enough, since we're talking about going to Monte Carlo with Pete and Mimi Polovtsov, Mimi was not Pete's wife. She was Pete's sister-in-law. She was Sasha, Alexander's wife. So I'm not sure why they were traveling together. The Polovtsovs had a home called Saint Roman in outside of where was it? It was close to Monte Carlo. I don't know if it was in Monaco or in France. And Pete was or would become one of the directors of the casino in Monte Carlo. And after the revolution, he was not a sinister person like General Schwartz. after the revolution. In fact, he had been in the Duma and on the military committee, and I believe he had been, or was it Schwartz, who'd been Kornilov's replacement, and so he'd been trusted by the provisional government. And I'm glad that Dmitri didn't let that be a barrier between the two of them. So that is it for that diary entry. I've gone 40 minutes now. So like I said, this is really an experiment because these require a lot of explanation. And I don't know if you want to, if you want to listen to a video that's that long. But having started with this particular diary entry, there shouldn't be as much need to fill in background information and introduce people in the next few videos, if indeed I go on and do more of these. So if any of you would be so kind as to let me know what you think and whether I should go forward. I'm committed to doing the 1906, to continue the videos of the 1906-1907 diaries, but it would be possible to do these as well. So let me know. Bye.